Hey everybody, welcome to Skeleton Keys.
I'm Torri and John.
And I'm John Booker.
And together we're going to try to unlock the mysteries of mythology and history in pop culture.
You know, Torri, we don't always live up to the mysteries of mythology, but in today's episode, we are going to live up to the mysteries of mythology.
The deep mysteries, the deep space mysteries, if you will.
Yes. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that it sort of splits audiences right down the middle. People either love it or hate it. And I think the audience will be fairly clear where we come down on it by the end of the episode, as well as where our guest comes down on it. I don't think there's going to be any room for ambiguity when it comes to how we feel about this particular topic. But I guess we just have to throw it out there. We're talking about ancient aliens today.
Yep.
And do you remember how you became introduced to this show?
I remember when it first came out thinking, where are the history shows on History Channel? Because I didn't understand why all the Egyptology shows were gone.
Yeah.
So I watched an episode and I, as a historian, had some thoughts.
I bet you did. I bet you did. Yes. I think somebody that I respect a great deal said, hey, have you ever watched Ancient Aliens? And I was like, ugh, no. And he said, well, you totally should. It's fascinating. And I said, oh, well, I respect this person's opinion a lot. And I watched the show, and my opinion of Ancient Aliens did not change, but my opinion of the recommender greatly changed. And it was funny because a day or two later, my brother, who's also a historian, I mentioned to him, oh, I checked out that show, Ancient Aliens. And he gave me this look like I had just told him, you know, that I had like murdered children or something. He looked at me like he had never been more disappointed in me in his whole life. And I started to get a picture of how strongly people feel about this show.
It's one of those things. I had something similar happen to me too, where I was doing a shoot for something completely different than history. And somebody found out that I was a historian. He goes, oh, so you must love Ancient Aliens. And I swear I heard like the Kill Bill sirens go off in my head, like, and I was like, no. I tried to be as diplomatic as possible.
Amazing.
But you know what? I get it.
Yeah.
I understand the appeal. So
Yeah.
I try not to be as judgmental as I want to be because I understand it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and this is part of what we're going to get into today is this, in a way, is a very complex topic because there is this innate desire in human beings to explore the curiosity. Is there something beyond us? Is there a world or a collection of people somewhere out there that we don't know about? And, you know, this is something that humankind has been interested in and grasping at since the beginning. And I think it goes back to this psychological idea of otherness, which is a big deal in mythology. This, of course, originates like when we are little bitty babies and we don't fully recognize that the world and mom and all these, you know, things we're engaging and encountering are separate from us. But at some point, as babies, we begin to recognize there's me and then there's the other. There are other people. There's, you know, things that react when I manipulate them in some way. And so it's like one of our oldest genetic impulses is this recognition of otherness. However, that recognition gets arrested in so many people that we become fixated on the otherness. And we become absolutely frightened of otherness. Anything that's different, anything that is outside of what we are used to, or what we experience. And of course, this leads to racism and xenophobia and sexism and all sorts of other, psychological human conditions. But I think it all goes back to otherness. What do you think?
I 100% agree with that. I think it's one of those things where otherness is something that we're scared of, but that we're attracted to.
Yeah.
That we're intrigued by, because it's not us. We don't understand it. There's something elevated in a way about otherness, because you can even put it down to, in terms of racialness, cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
That's different, but I want to have a piece of that. I want to be a part of that.
Yeah.
And so I think the popularity of a show like Ancient Aliens makes perfect sense to me, because what is more other than an extraterrestrial?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We always seem to come back to, as human beings, our united recognition that, hey, we're all human, right? Mm-hmm. But what if we're not all human? What if there's an other outside of human? And, we recognize that some things outside of humanity are great, like animals. Rarely do you meet somebody that says, I hate animals, right?
Yeah, because you're like, all animals?
Right, exactly. That just seems like a psycho, who would say that. But we absolutely have some very mixed feelings about the possibilities of extraterrestrial life. Mm-hmm. Some of us are afraid of that. Some of us totally believe it exists. Some of us believe that the government is hiding it, and covering it up. And some of us don't believe in it at all.
Yeah.
And I think the point of whether or not aliens exist, it's sort of beside the point in this whole discussion. For me personally, all I can say is I've seen no credible evidence of such. It doesn't mean that we won't someday discover something, but as of this point, personally, I've seen no credible evidence. How about you, Torri? Have you been visited by an alien?
Sadly, no.
Sadly, no.
I have not had that pleasure or pain. I'm not sure which they would do. I'm kind of the ilk of like, there's a lot of planets and a lot of galaxies, and a lot of stars.
Yeah.
The law of averages says we're probably not the only living people out there, but I'm like you in that I have not seen proof of it.
Yeah.
Even within ancient history, I have not seen proof of aliens.
Yeah.
So
I'm
open to being wrong, but that's how I feel about it.
Well, I feel like, we can trace this discussion of otherness back a long way. And while we could probably even go further than this, I think one place mythologically that we can trace this discussion is back to Plato's Symposium. And in the Symposium, Plato, has this character Aristophanes, who's this famous Greek theater and comedy writer. And Aristophanes tells the story of soulmates. And Aristophanes tells this story that basically in the beginning, there were three genders in nature. There were man, woman, and the androgynous. And that literally means man, woman in Greek. And what it was is every person was actually two people. So you had one type of person that were two men that were attached together. You had another type of person that were two women attached together. And then you had a third type of person that was a man and a woman attached together. Now, each gender had two sets of genitalia, with the androgynous having both the male and female sex. And, the gender of humans had to do with their origin. So the men were the children of the sun, and the women were the children of the earth, and the androgynous were the children of the moon, born out of this merging of sun and earth. And I think, we hear that and say, that is crazy. That certainly doesn't account for all gender identities, or that doesn't account for all expressions of sexuality. And, whenever we talk about history, we have to acknowledge that. And we have to point out, that these ideas that we currently, have been fortunate enough to develop around identity and around gender and sexuality. In many ways, these are new ideas. They're not new experiences for people, but they're newly articulated, shall we say.
Perfectly said. Yeah.
Yeah. So, at this time in this story that Aristophanes tells, these humans were very, very powerful creatures, and they were fearless, and they're very strong, and the gods became very threatened by them. And the gods were afraid that these humans that were so strong were going to overthrow the gods, and that they were going to set up a new species of gods, these new gods. And so Zeus, being the solution-minded god that he was, he comes up with this other solution. And his solution was, hey, let's split humans in half and punish them because, they're so prideful and they're so full of hubris. Let's just punish them for who they are. And so Apollo, who's the god of music and truth and prophecy and healing and light, he couldn't bear to see humans like this, split apart like this. So to ease their pain, he sews them back up, and he reconstitutes their bodily forms, and he just leaves the navel as the only reminder of their original form. So, so humans go from these two-faced, two-sexed creatures with 8 limbs to these creatures that are single-faced with a single set of genitalia and 2 arms and 2 legs. And forever, human beings then are on a search for their other half, for their soulmate. They're looking for that person who's was the part of me that I was separated from, the not part of me. And that not part of me, throughout history has often caused us great fear and insecurity. And aliens, I think, originate from that fear. But, mythologically, that's sort of where we have the basis of this idea of otherness is, there's someone who's not me, but if I can find them and make them part of my life, I'll be complete.
Yeah. I'll be more powerful. I'll be, like you were saying, when the humans were, before they were split, powerful, terrifying, could challenge the gods.
Yeah.
And so if you find that other half or that other, you can reach that power. You can reach the godlike feeling of being one of the new gods.
Yeah. It's sort of a beautiful story too.
Yeah, it's very romantic.
It's very romantic. We're all in search for, that completion. And in some ways it was very progressive for the time because, if you were a man who was split from another man, you're searching for that man who is going to complete you, in the same thing with women or heterosexual couples. While it didn't include all gender or sexual expressions or identities, it was pretty progressive for the time to include gay and lesbian themes, in the story that was being told. I have been waiting to get to this point in the episode since we began. So we've got to jump right into our first segment, which is something we always do on this podcast. It's called Skeleton Keys, and we bring a skeleton from our closet. Torri, I'm going to bring one of my oldest stories out of the closet. And because we're talking about aliens, this is a story about aliens. Now, I wish I had a story, to share with you about the time, aliens came and took me up in their ship and used me for human experiments. I just don't have one of those stories. I don't.
Next time.
But I did have a meaningful relationship with an alien when I was a child, and that alien was named E.T., the extraterrestrial. Torri, I fell in love with this movie. I fell in love with E.T., and I actually went and saw E.T. in the theaters more than 5 times.
That's so sweet.
Well, it's sweet. Here's what's even sweeter. Torri, you may recall E.T. had this candy that he loved called Reese's Pieces.
He did.
And
He was very fond of those.
very fond of them. And, a little bit of side trivia. Originally, the Mars Corporation was approached, and originally it was supposed to be M&M's in the movie. And the M&M Corporation is like, nah, we don't want to really associate our brand with some weird alien movie or whatever. But, the sales of Reese's Pieces after they were featured in this movie, like 10 times the year before. So, haha, M&M's on you. Sorry. But here's the thing. I saw this movie. I saw E.T. eating the Reese's Pieces. Torri, every time I went and saw E.T., and every time I would go to the store to buy candy, I would buy and eat Reese's Pieces. And here's the thing. I didn't even like Reese's Pieces. I just so badly wanted to eat E.T.'s food that I just ate Reese's Pieces because that's what E.T. ate.
Did you want to be E.T. or did you want to be his friend?
Well, therein lies the crux of this complex issue. I didn't see a way. I mean, E.T. was kind of gross to me. He had this squatty little body and these feet, but there was also something I kind of related to that was like, oh, he feels like Quasimodo, and I felt like Quasimodo, so I kind of related to that, but. Mm-hmm. I sure would have loved to have been Elliot and befriend E.T. And so, maybe if I would eat E.T.'s food, it would be an invitation, to any aliens who happen to be in the East Texas region to come and hang out with me. Never happened, but to this day, I love every other Reese's product, but not a fan of Reese's Pieces. And it's probably because I ate them so much as a child when I didn't want to, just trying to be like E.T., eat his food.
How long did that passage of eating Reese's Pieces last?
Oh, certainly not more than 10 or 15 years, for sure. I'm kidding. No. But it was probably a solid 2 years of my life that were spent eating Reese's Pieces. When I was a kid, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, we didn't go to the movies that often. So although it sounds like we did because I saw E.T. 5 times, but I mean, we probably would only see, a couple of movies a year in the theater. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the thing. My father managed a movie theater when I was at this young age, and he had a deal with the other movie theater owner in town that we could go see movies at their theater. And so we would often go see movies multiple times because we could see them, for free. But we didn't see a wide scope and variety of movies in the theater. We would often see the same movies over and over again, and thus I saw E.T. like 5 times. But that is my skeleton key for this episode. E.T., Reese's Pieces, skeleton in the closet.
Well, my skeleton key is also because of my connection to a famous movie, Alien. But it's about my crush on a famous movie, Alien. Okay. Specifically, Predator from Predator. I was just, listen... I legitimately had a crush on the Predator. I think
tales of interspecies love are not as uncommon as you would think, Torri. It turns out many people love aliens.
That makes me feel better because every time people would bring up aliens, for some reason it would become like sexual about like a hot alien. So I felt vindicated in that I had a weird crush on the Predator, but it was just something about his dreads.
Torri, you can love aliens, but don't love aliens.
I love the Predator, and like the way he could. I'm moving, so you can't see it because it's audio. But like he would move really fast, and I just thought that was really hot. I still do.
I love it.
Not when he takes the mask off.
Yeah. No.
I want to preface that.
It's the essence
only with the mask on.
Of Predator.
But I like to say when 13-year-old Torri was really into AJ from the Backstreet Boys and Predator from Predator.
If AJ from Backstreet Boys had somehow been able to grow dreadlocks, you might
That's my dream man.
Yeah, it's like your dream guy. Yeah. Oh, wow.
So
did you ever share this obsession with anyone? Did you go out on a limb and share your feelings?
I was smart enough not to do that as a teen. As an adult, I told some friends, and then it became like they thought I was joking. I was like, no, I legitimately had a crush on the Predator. And so I have a friend, Chelsea, who went to New York. In Times Square, people will dress up.
Yeah.
Predator was dressed up in New York when she was there. And so she FaceTimed me and was like, I'm with your husband. He was very confused.
So guys out there listening to the podcast, if you happen to bear a striking resemblance to the Predator, Torri Yates Orr is accepting applications via our email address for, future Predator-like mates. So please, contact us.
I'm available.
That's amazing. Wow. I never know what kind of story you're going to share, but let me tell you, didn't see that one coming. That is amazing. That is, wow. Well, let's move forward.
Please.
Let's move away from interspecies love and move towards our next segment. We always, like to talk a bit about the archetypes, that a particular mythological motif or a particular, topic that we're talking about embodies. And we've spoken briefly about this, psychological motif of the other. And there's this further psychological idea about othering people. It's one thing to recognize that that something is different than us. I am not a tree. And it's a different thing to recognize that someone is different than us. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the problem is obviously when this leads to racism, homophobia, xenophobia, sexism, obviously this is very problematic. However, I think it's also equally problematic, and I'm really curious to hear your take on this. I think it's equally problematic when people deny the other, like when people say, oh, I don't see race. We're all just one human race. We're all just one, big pile of humanity or whatever.
Yeah.
I think the denial of othering is a problem. What do you think?
I'm not a fan of that.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of saying I don't see race or we're all the same color, human. Mm-hmm. That, to me, feels like you don't see me.
Yeah.
You don't see my experiences and vice versa.
Yeah.
I think it's impossible not to see race.
Right.
It's impossible.
Right.
So for someone to say that it's kind of lying because that's just that's not the way our world functions.
Right.
Now, I'm not just my race, but that is a big part of me.
Yeah.
And that is a big part of my culture and where I come from. And that's going to color my experiences, which is also going to color your experiences. Your experiences can be different because where you grew up.
Yeah.
So I think to just say blanketly, I don't see race is a problem as much as only seeing the divisions that we have within us is a problem.
Yeah.
There's a way to incorporate the whole and our separate, beautiful differences as well.
Yeah. Well, I think talking about race is a perfect transition into going back into Ancient Aliens because...
Oh, Lord.
Yeah. Torri, if you had to narrow it down and say, here's why I don't like Ancient Aliens in a simple encapsulated version, what would you say? Why?
All right. Okay. I'm not going to just dunk on it.
Okay.
I want to, but I'm not going to.
All right.
Ancient Aliens is incredibly problematic. One, because it's based in little to no actual fact. Historians, archaeologists, scientists train their whole lives to learn about these things. They're not asked for their opinion for these shows, interestingly enough. Also, a big push about why people don't like Ancient Aliens is because it has a lot of racist undertones. It's very much, how could these predominantly ancient cultures that included brown and black people, you don't see them. They're touching into other ancient cultures that were white. That's because they're 14, 15 seasons in.
Yeah.
They got to start doing that. But primarily, they basically started looking at ancient Egypt, ancient Maya culture, brown and black cultures, saying there's no way they could have created these cultures without the help of aliens. This goes back to Chariots of the Gods, which is kind of like the Bible of the ancient alien theory that also has racist overtones within the book. And so a lot of people, I mean, obviously people who are from a factual background don't like the show, but also understanding that there is kind of this racial undertone underneath it of like, there's no way these brown and black people couldn't have possibly done this without the help of these aliens. How did they create it?
Right. I mean,
and if you watch it and you look for that, you see it.
It's funny because I had never even heard this observation about the show before I watched it. And the first time I ever watched it, I was like, this feels super racist to me. That, you know, it's like, well, if we European white people didn't figure out, how to do it at this time, certainly these brown people could. It had to be aliens. Had to be aliens. Had to have.
These pyramids, how do they build them? There's no way that that's just the easiest way to stack rocks.
You know, and I'm embarrassed to say that, you know, the aliens card is one that white people continue to play when there's things we don't understand. I'm embarrassed to say that the alien card has not been removed from the Caucasian deck as of yet, because, you know, there's quite a lot of people. Go to YouTube. You can find all sorts of people telling you about the aliens that they've encountered. I do think, you know, one thing I do want to acknowledge from a psychological perspective that I do think is interesting is that depending on what is going on in your world, in your life, there is a great deal of psychological evidence that people tend to, quote unquote, see things that are not there. For example, where I live in Los Angeles, there are tons of reports of people seeing these particular monsters right around and after the time of the Great Depression. And there's newspaper articles that I got really fascinated by this for a while.
This is cool.
It is, yeah. And again, a lot of psychologists have done work where they look into these things and say there are certain psychological conditions that can be set up for people where we are needing a certain expression of something. And when someone says, I saw this with my own eyes, they're not lying. They really did experience, you know, this thing. Now, that doesn't mean the thing was actually there. You know, a psychological experience can be very, very real to the person that has it, but it doesn't mean that, you know, our boundaries of reality are not accurate. But this is a real thing. At different times throughout history, when certain conditions, especially very difficult conditions, that we don't understand why something is happening, there seems to be an uptick in these creations of the human psyche that people claim to have seen. And so I want to, you know, acknowledge that and say that everyone who claims to have seen an alien, you know, may not just be lying about it, or may not just be, you know, a mentally unbalanced person. It could be something that is created in their psyche due to the conditions in their environment that they're surrounded by. And again, there's a number of documented cases of people seeing even very similar creatures. In Latin American culture. There's a creature called the chupacabra that is this you know, creature that there's no evidence that actually exists, but is claimed to, you know, have been seen by a multitude of people. And there's been psychologists that have looked at that and said, wow, it's really interesting that this particular creature seems to only be encountered in Latin American cultures. So is there something particular to Latin American culture that lends itself to chupacabra sightings, you know? And I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm just saying these are some of the discussions, you know, that tend to happen among psychologists when it comes to aliens and creatures out there.
I think that's important to, like I said, I'm not even dunking on people who do experience that because I don't know what they experience.
Yeah.
Even when I was reading about alien abductions, I would never tell someone what you experience is wrong because I wasn't there.
Yeah.
I don't know their experience. And I think that's really important to understand of like the personal experience, what was going on, these phenomenon are important to examine.
Yeah.
I think what Ancient Aliens does is play on all of our interest in that and all of our want of the supernatural and that kind of wondering, well, what could it be?
Yeah.
And turns it into a show that claims to be about historical significance.
Right.
And I think that's where people you're kind of putting those two together, and they shouldn't necessarily be together. They're both valid,
Yeah.
but maybe not together.
Well, and our guest today would be, I would say, one of the people at the forefront of this movement of being deeply bothered by the show Ancient Aliens. Wouldn't you?
Yeah, maybe like the Grand Marshal.
I think so. Which I love to hear him talk about this. I love following him on Twitter. And I love really smart people that engage ideas like this seriously, that are not just about insulting those that believe, in these things, but that deeply engage them seriously. And our guest today, Dr. David S. Anderson, is someone who does that. He has a PhD in archaeology from Tulane, which is no small accomplishment.
Not at all.
Yeah, he studies Mesoamerica, and he also studies pseudoarchaeology, which makes him a perfect voice for speaking to this issue. And while it certainly is only one aspect of his work, he is a man with a passion for seeing Ancient Aliens canceled. I saw even recently on Twitter, he before it is canceled would like them to actually do a whole show of apologies and setting the record straight about these things. So he doesn't want it to just go off the air before they repent of their sins. But you are in for a treat today, as our guest on Skeleton Keys is Dr. David S. Anderson. Dr. David S. Anderson, welcome to Skeleton Keys.
Thank you for having me. It's a thrill to be here.
We are really excited to have you because you are someone whose work has really it seems to me like maybe you got bored with standard archaeology and academia and said, let me go find the outer realms of what is really interesting and let me, explore that, which is wonderful because you're someone whose work has not only focused around, the Maya culture and Maya mythology and Maya archaeology, but someone who has delved into pseudoscience. So how in the world did you become interested in pseudoscience, and what sparked this this flame inside you?
It's been a full circle, if you will, because I became interested in archaeology and started studying archaeology when I was in school because I picked up a book that now I would consider to be pseudoarchaeology and pseudoscientific. I was 18 years old. I was going off to college. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I was enrolled as a business major, which is great for some people, but was really not where I needed to go. And I picked up a book by a man named Graham Hancock, Fingerprints of the Gods, which was all about how archaeologists had sort of overlooked or not realized that there was this sort of a fantastical lost civilization from about 12, 13,000 years ago. And I was hooked. He talked all about how the professional archaeologists were sort of covering up the truth or weren't really acknowledging or understanding what was right before their nose. And, when I read that book, I was like, yeah, this is, really amazing. There's a couple of things that seemed out of, too far stretched for me, but I was like, this is it. I'm like, I got to go to archaeology. I got to overturn this high-bound, narrow-minded academy. And then I started learning, reading archaeology books and talking to archaeologists. And it was like, wait wait a second, like everything he's putting out here is just fundamentally problematic, if not outright wrong. And this pushed me, and I loved it. I loved archaeology, and as I got more and more into it, and when I was finishing up my PhD and starting to sort of look, well, what do I do now? Yeah, you're right, John. I was a little bit like, well, I mean, I guess I can keep doing normal archaeology, and I've done plenty of that, and I still do plenty of that. But I felt like there was a real gap where my profession wasn't talking about things like lost civilizations and ancient aliens. But every time I met somebody on the street or at a party or at a bar, that's what they asked me about. It's like this stuff, we need to deal with this stuff. We need to engage with it somehow. I should give credit to my forebears. I'm not the first person to actually start talking about this. There's by a long shot, there are several people who have been working on this for years, but it has always been a very small number of people.
Well, like you were saying, you're not the first, but you're probably one of the most vocal in kind of talking about the problematic nature of shows like Ancient Aliens and talking about lost civilizations. Can you just say why these programs are so problematic right now?
Especially in the moment. So much of pseudoarchaeological claims are race-based. It's not on the surface, and sometimes I think even the people who support them today don't always recognize or realize what they're doing. So shows like Ancient Aliens in particular, is really problematic this way. I mean, the basic premise of the show and the books that it was based upon are that many people in the ancient world, they couldn't possibly have built those pyramids. They couldn't possibly have cut stone in straight lines or something like this without some help. And the reality is that the vast majority of cultures they talk about are people of color, indigenous populations outside of Europe in one way or another. Yes, they did an episode about the Vikings. Yes, they did, they like one or two Roman sites, but the vast majority of things they talk about are from Africa or Native America outside of Europe. And a lot of what they're doing is piggybacking on old 19th century racial beliefs that there were, in essence, lost white tribes all over the world that were actually responsible for the mounds of North America or Great Zimbabwe in Africa. They're repeating the exact same stories that were happening in the 19th century and the early 20th century that said these things couldn't have been built by people of color. It had to have been lost white tribes. Ancient Aliens is repeating the exact same script, but with grays.
That is succinctly put, and so problematic and disappointing because, these are shows coming out on platforms which are supposedly based around offering authentic history and mythology. And
TV in general, in my experience with TV shows is anecdotal. And so, that is what it is. I've interviewed to be on a few shows. I've tried to pitch my own show to people. And I have lots of colleagues who have been interviewed for shows who ended up not using what they said because it didn't fit the narrative that the producers already wanted. I was interviewed for a show about a lost city in South America, and I actually explained to the producers. It was a very interesting interview because the producers at the end of the interview basically said to me, like, well, you know more about this than anyone we've talked to. And there's this very clear subtext. We're not having you on the show. I walked them through how they were trying to follow this man, Percy Fawcett, who was a British explorer in the 1920s who was lost in the Amazon looking for what he called the city of Z. In Fawcett's memoirs, and he was very explicit that this was a city built by a lost white race. He even has a native Amazonian at one point tell him, yes, my ancestors built cities in the Amazon. And Fawcett wrote down in his memoir, this guy's not telling me the truth because, he is of the brown-skinned variety. It has to have been a white-skinned person who had made this city. And I explained this to the people making this show who were trying to follow in Fawcett's footsteps. And they're like, oh, well, but we don't want to make a show about race. You are making a show about race. You can ignore it if you want to. But it is not in the background. It is critical and forefront in Fawcett's claims. But that stuff doesn't make for reassuring basic cable TV shows that people want to watch.
Well, the part B to my question there then would be, I'm reminded of Wade Davis's book, The Wayfinders. He talks about, he's the head adventurer for National Geographic, I think is his title. But he talks about a bit of the history, especially in that part of the world, of how many different people claimed accounts of encountering Amazon women, these very violent, vicious, huge, tall women that, would chase them out of certain areas. And basically that's become almost a measuring stick for how accurate we believe the accounts of these different, adventures to be. Why is history and archaeology so consistently flooded with tales of hokum, for lack of a better term?
There are many reasons, and so we've got a few hours here, right? The past is powerful. There's a definite tendency. I think people are like, oh, you do archaeology or you're a historian. Like, well, I guess your job's done. Nothing's ever going to change. Or past is extremely and extraordinarily powerful in the way that people use it to justify political regimes or beliefs about certain cultures or certain races. And in the past, it's constantly invoked in the present. Actually, one of my favorite ways of I have a collection of photographs in my archives of just all the different units of money, bills and coins from around the world that people have put archaeological sites or ancient monuments on. It's like people are constantly picking up images from the past and shoving them into our face to justify the current nature of the world. And when the past is that powerful and ever present, people are going to manipulate it. They're going to manipulate it whenever they can. And so I think that's something I tell my students in the classroom. Like when we start getting into the nitty gritty about certain historical issues or ancient cultures, it's like there is a way where these details are esoteric. You don't necessarily need to know what a Maya house looked like from 500 BC. But the reality is if you don't know your facts and if you don't know the outline of human history and what that outline is based on, people will abuse your lack of knowledge and they will manipulate you as a result. And so there are so many layers here, but I think the most important thing is that the past is used by politicians all the time. And so they will bend it to their will whenever necessary.
And kind of piggybacking off of that, of why this is, so important. It's a popular show. It's a really popular show. And history has kind of doubled down on it. Now we have, I think, Alien Con. Why do you think why do you think this has become what they're synonymous with? Why do you think it's so popular? Not even just from politicians, but from the public, of being like aliens, more so than actually learning about the actual facts of the people who actually did these things.
Presumption, I think, for a lot of people that's rooted in 100 years of writing fiction and comic books and other things that I'm interested in, that the ancient world is a blank slate. That they didn't have writing, or they had writing that's hard for us to understand and interpret. And so there's sort of this long-standing history of people, as a result, painting what they want to see on the ancient world. And this is, I think, to a certain extent, a fault or an issue of archaeologists. We need to tell people. It's like on a math problem. The teacher asks you to show your work. Don't just give me the answer. Show, how did you get that answer? And I think archaeologists need to do a better job of, we're not making stuff up. Like when we try to explain what is the outline of history, like people have accused me many times of like, oh, archaeologists just change dates on things whenever it suits them. It's like, no, we have a lot of very detailed dating methods that are reinforced not by radiocarbon dating. Yes, there are real problems with radiocarbon dating, and it doesn't always work, and it has error ranges. But we never use radiocarbon dating alone. It's always in context with different types of seriation and stratigraphic dating and a whole bunch of other techniques. And I think we need to do a better job of showing our work and showing how we know what we know about the past. But it skirts around your question, Torri, and it's like, why do people want to watch Ancient Aliens? I think it presents this sort of fantastical vision of like, what if? And, I think it even speaks to how I got into archaeology. I mean, I got drawn into this by these tales of lost civilizations. And it's, something I think a lot of people will say to me and my colleagues, like, oh, well, you represent the status quo. And you can't let that status quo go, or you'll lose your job, or you won't be able to, career that. We're part of big archaeology in some way, shape, or form. It's like, if I could prove that there was ancient alien contact, if I could prove that there was a civilization 12,000, 13,000 years ago, I would totally do it. If I had the data and the evidence to back that claim up, I would publish it. I would become famous for doing it. Like, it would be really good. It'd be really important. The data for this stuff doesn't exist at all. And so it really becomes this sort of pure flight of fancy. And flights of fancy are fun. And so I think that's sort of twists together all of these issues.
You bring up sort of this intersection of aliens and comic books and belief. And, there's some really interesting work that's been done around sort of the intersection of many of those things. Carl Jung wrote a book that, tackled the idea of aliens and belief in aliens. More recently, Jeffrey Kripal has dealt quite a bit with, the idea of belief in aliens and the possibilities of aliens. Kripal, of course, did the book Mutants and Mystics that also tackles comic books. Can you speak to, this intersection of aliens in comic books and belief that is being taken seriously by very smart people in the academic world?
So much of this is that, Kripal's work is interesting and very dense. I always find Kripal a little bit dense to dig through. And the reality is, I think, he's very interested in coincidences, I would say. And I will never forget reading his book, Authors of the Impossible, as one he published right before Mutants and Mystics. And it's a book that, in essence, it's a series of biographies of different paranormal authors. And I used it in a class that I taught about paranormal belief, and I was reading it with a group of students, and it's sort of like I feel like you kind of watched him transform as he was writing this book, where he went at the beginning like, I'm a religious studies professor and I'm studying this stuff because it's it's interesting and it's relevant. And by the time you get to the end of the book, I'm like, I think you're on the other team now. Like, I think you're fully believing all the things you're writing about, and it seems that some of his work has continued to trend in that direction. And I think, it's, for him, as I said, it's about coincidence. And there's all of this that, the more often we see the same imagery, the same ideas, the same claims ripple, but from one source to another. For Kripal, it seems like there's more reality to it. There's more, it sort of exists in the zeitgeist. And, I come at this from the archaeological perspective. I'm an archaeologist. I got interested in ancient aliens in particular from a perspective of how do we talk about how it's not real. And so when I look at the same comic books he does, it sort of says different things to me, which I think is the beauty of these kind of images too, right? As I've just finished working on an article that will hopefully come out in the next year about the presence of pseudoarchaeological claims in comic books in general, but a lot of it definitely focuses on ancient aliens. And I think the thing that struck me is even I was surprised. Like, I started working, I gave a conference paper on this a few years ago, and I started working on it. And I knew a handful of examples of ancient alien references in comic books that predated 1968, which is a really important date in the history of ancient alien claims, because that is when Eric von Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods, was published. And if people aren't familiar, like, it's the ancient alien book that popularized the idea. It sold millions of copies. It was translated into, I think, like 30 different languages. It helped to inspire the TV show In Search Of. It is ultimately, Eric von Daniken is an executive producer for the History Channel show in the present. And the modern Ancient Aliens show was founded based on his book. I knew a couple of Ancient Aliens references that predated his book in comic books. I'm like, that's kind of funny, where it's like, wow, yes, there's aliens coming down to Earth in ancient Egypt or whatnot. It's like, that's weird. And then I started digging and coming up with more and more examples. And in essence, what I found is that there were so many of these things that before 68, by the early 60s, there are actual tropes that have developed in fictional stories about ancient alien contact. Like, by the early 60s, every time a comic book or a pulp fiction or a science fiction author writes about this stuff, the aliens are gods. Our ancestors have to assume that they must have been gods, and that's the only explanation. And that all science, advanced technology, that these spacecraft and the ray guns or whatever they have, that our primitive ancestors assume that they must have been magic. All of that stuff is in fiction, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, to the point of becoming a trope years before Eric von Däniken even published Chariots of the Gods. And so it's one of these funny things, and you can go both ways. As I would not argue, and I don't argue, that I don't think Eric von Däniken was copying comic books. Like, I don't think it was, maybe they're in the back of his head somewhere, maybe, but I don't think that's necessarily even true. I think he's tapped into sort of the same cultural imagination. He's decided it's real. The comic book authors are starting to just exploit it for their own fun stories. And I think, for Kripal, I think that's something that's a resonance, that's a coincidence that he would find compelling from sort of his perspective. To me, it's just one more sort of chink in the wall of like, why are we supposed to take this as real when all of a sudden, when we have like 20 odd authors over here using it in their science fiction stories, and then one guy comes out and says like, no, it's real. It really makes me sort of like scratch my head. It's like, well, why is this stuff, what is it about this stuff? And clearly, there's lots of examples of this in pulp fiction and in the comic books as well, that a lot of the fictional authors are clearly playing with the idea. Maybe it's real, maybe it's not. And that's fun to do in fiction. That's a lot of fun to do in fiction, and it engages your audience in a very real way that you want to engage them. But it does build doubt in people's minds. In the long term, years later, when you're like, I don't remember where I read this or where I heard it, but yeah, I think, wasn't there some kind of carving from Egypt that had something funny on it that looked alien-like or spaceship-like? And I think, for a lot of people, you just don't quite remember where you got it from years down the line.
Yeah, I think it's like myth and history kind of that they all start to blur, and you're like, was it Indiana Jones or was it like actually in a book?
Yeah.
I know I've done that. Well, I mean, history is doing that now, but in your opinion, what can they do to rectify the damage that they've done with Ancient Aliens? Or do you even think it can be fixed?
And they're 14 seasons in at this point. If we're talking about History Channel and Ancient Aliens, and they're, and as you noted, Torri, they're it's not just a TV show anymore. They have conventions that are, or sort of styled around Comic-Con style conventions where people dress up and wait in line. And I think, history is too deep in. Like they can't, I don't know what the producers at History believe. Do they just see this as a cash cow? Do they actually believe themselves? I don't know. And I'm not sure it matters because they are so deep in. I don't think that they can let go. I mean, they would have to, and it's what we need to do. And what I try to do in my work, in my writing and talking to folks like you is to say, like, plenty of my colleagues in the past have debunked these claims. Ancient Alien, like Eric von Däniken's books were debunked pretty much as soon as they came out. People started writing articles in their own books about what was wrong with what he was claiming. And yet, I think it's something I haven't said that I like to repeat a lot to make sure the audience knows how serious this is. In a 2018 survey, 41% of Americans said that they agree or strongly agree that ancient alien contact really happened. This isn't some small fringe thing, and that number has been growing over multiple years of that survey too. This is something that almost 41%, like 41% of Americans to say that my profession is lying to them. And this is an issue where it's like debunking's easy. We can talk individual examples. What does von Däniken claim? What does the TV show claim? It's really easy to pick apart those individual examples. And if people haven't checked out Jason Colavito's website, Jason Colavito is an incredibly dedicated scholar who has done that hard work and picked apart their individual examples and said, look, these individual examples are totally bunk. And yet we're still here. 41%. This concept has been debunked for 50 years ongoing. And we're here with 41% of people believing. I don't think we have an information problem. I think we have a culture problem. And so, History Channel could air a retraction. And I would love it if they aired a retraction. But I think we pretty much get a whole new genre of truthers coming out at right away, where it'd be like, oh no, History Channel was forced to retract because of the corporate entities of big archaeology in some way. Like, I think we need to talk about this stuff openly. We need to talk about the cultural influences behind it, not just the information behind it, what's wrong with the archaeology, but that this was in comic books for decades. It was in pulp fiction before that. All of this is a very old idea. In fact, the oldest reference I know so far, and there could be older ones, but like that, the idea that aliens built the pyramids of Egypt in particular. The oldest example that I know of that comes from the 1890s from a fictional author. And I'm going to get his name wrong. I think it's Garrett Service. I'm going to get his name wrong. But he actually is someone who plagiarized H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and basically wrote his own version of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and then decided to write a sequel to War of the Worlds after that, called Edison's Conquest of Mars. In this, the humans go to Mars and they take the fight to the Martians. And when they're there, they encounter this colony of humans on Mars who tell this story that their ancestors had been kidnapped from Earth thousands of years beforehand, when the Martians had come to Earth to build the pyramids and the Sphinx. It's like, this is a 100-year-old idea, and the oldest example, there's some older stuff that I can point to that's sort of in the esoterical, spiritual record, but it's a little vaguer, and it doesn't have these specific kind of ideas that aliens built the pyramids or something. It's like, this is a 100-year-old idea, and it's interweaved between our fiction, between our spiritual writings, and then all of these people who crop up every once in a while, and they're like, hey, maybe it's actually true, and all at the same time. And I think after 100 years of that, after 100 years of people playing with this idea of ancient alien contact, how would people on the street, if you don't obsess over this stuff like I do, how would you know? Like, one of my favorite things that I came out with of working when I was researching the paper that I just worked on, in von Daniken's book in '68, he claims that he's a little bit vague about this, but he basically says, and he says it a couple of times in Chariots of the Gods, that the aliens had been on a spaceship alone for a pretty long time when they got to Earth, and those Earth women looked awfully nice. And he basically says that that they picked the nicest looking Earth women and mated with them. And this resulted in the modern human species that we have. Well, that was kind of rough for some of the people. Like, so when Jack Kirby wrote The Eternals, which is one of the most influential ancient alien comic books, The Eternals, which they're about to make a movie of, was very explicitly an homage to Eric von Daniken. And even though Kirby had actually been writing ancient alien stories before von Daniken was, Kirby comes back and writes a new book in honor of Eric von Daniken. But Kirby, he's got to deal with comic book authorities and whatnot. He can't have the aliens having sex with the humans. And so he actually changes that to sort of some genetic engineering, and that the aliens create humans using genetic engineering. A couple years later, Eric von Daniken actually decided to come out with his own comic books about ancient alien contact. And in those comic books, he decided as well to do sort of this genetic engineering rather than the mating with the dim proto-humans. It's like, there's where these ideas come from. Like, the big idea of ancient alien contact's got a 100-year history. But when you talk about, like, well, what was their interaction with humans, you have to, like, it winds back and forth between the sources that claim to be just stories and fiction and the people who claim they're telling the truth. And who's getting ideas from whom is really hard to tell sometimes.
Well, Dr. Anderson, we are so honored that you would take time today to come and talk to us about your work and about pseudoscience and ancient aliens. I highly, highly recommend every one of our listeners follow you on Twitter, because I think you're constantly bringing interesting ideas and interesting articles, and you're just a very worthy follow on Twitter. So can you tell us how to track and follow your work? What are the best ways to do that?
Yes. Oh, no, I'm at DSA Archaeology on Twitter. And I've got the same thing on Facebook and Instagram, although I'm more active on Twitter than the other places. But people can find me in any of those spaces, wherever they're most comfortable. Absolutely. And just thank you both so much for having me on. I really appreciate what you're doing. This kind of conversation about mythology and its modern impact is hugely important.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. Well, every time we have a guest, I feel like I learn so much. And David S. Anderson is somebody that I could sit and listen to talk for a long time, because it's just his lens for archaeology and mythology and the world in general is just fascinating to me.
And he's just so passionate about it. Yeah. That's what I love. Like, I'm like, oh, yes, I could listen. I'm going to ride into war with you right now. Let's go. Let's go.
Well, if we're going to ride into war, we need all the tools that we can, gather. And every episode, we also try and give you a tool that has been helpful to us in our journey. And it's a key. It's a skeleton key. So what sort of key did you bring for us today, Torri?
I was going to say the Predator movies, but I'm going to not say that. No, I'm just kidding. I actually went back and read Octavia Butler's Dawn. Ooh. And just kind of revisited that in terms of, because like I said, I naturally want to dunk on ancient aliens.
Yeah.
For coming from a history background and as a Black woman, I'm ready to fight. But when I was rereading Dawn, I'm like, I get the attraction to this.
Yeah.
I get why this is on TV. Because this understanding of like, maybe there are these people who are just in the Oankali and in Dawn, but aliens, ancient astronaut theories on ancient aliens. It's like, maybe there are these people who can better us, who can teach us new things. And revisiting Dawn and getting drawn back into that story, I had a lot more understanding of why ancient aliens is the force that it is.
Yeah.
Because I understand it now. I understand of why this, having these creatures or these people that we put on a pedestal, that we put as giving us knowledge, there's something comforting in knowing that's out there.
Yeah. Plus, just shout out to Octavia Butler.
I mean, come on.
So good. So good. And maybe one of the most underappreciated authors out there. I'm constantly shocked by how many people have never read an Octavia Butler book.
If you have not, I would completely agree with you on that one. If you have not read any Octavia Butler, please, there are a number of that you could go with. Kindred, Parable of the Sower. I mean, there's so many. She is a force of nature and is a writer in a way that draws you in, builds worlds that you don't want to leave. Please, just pick up an Octavia Butler book and then thank me later.
Yeah, right.
What about you? What's your key for today?
Yeah, I also am going to recommend a book, and I had trouble deciding between two, so I'm going to mention 3 books, actually.
Okay.
But the first is a book that I was turned on to in grad school by a thinker, a philosopher, a writer named Martin Buber. And Martin Buber wrote this book called I and Thou. And this book really gets at the philosophy of human beings as they discover otherness. And the whole idea is I recognize, who I am, and thou, and that complexity that we, talked about earlier in this episode between the importance of recognizing someone as being different than us, and then the danger of the recognition of someone being different than us. Because othering of people goes so far beyond just even race or gender identity or any of these, easy to point to things. Sometimes we just have trouble getting along with someone because of who they are, and we end up othering, that person. We we sometimes just have difficulty seeing that the oneness of all things, that what we do affects the environment. It affects others around us. And so this book really gets into that. I also, would be remiss if I didn't mention Carl Jung's book, Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky, which is a deep dive into the psychology around aliens and people that see aliens. However, I do not like to mention Carl Jung without also mentioning Fanny Brewster in her book, African Americans and Jungian Psychology, because, Carl Jung can be problematic on some issues of race and gender. And I want to offer you the helpful lens that Fanny Brewster comes to this work with. So anytime I recommend Jung, I want to make sure and recommend Fanny Brewster as a lens for taking a look at Carl Jung. So that is my key for this week. I feel like as we wrap things up, Torri, we both have talked a lot about our love for aliens, some of us with a deeper love than others, like yourself. But we've also talked about this idea, of aliens being sort of this container for feelings about race with ancient aliens. But I also want to mention that is not the only time in pop culture that we've seen aliens be this container for racial feelings. There's been quite a bit of writing and work and thought done around the series Alien, specifically the first movie, Alien, with the Ridley Scott film. And often that film has been examined as a exploration of ideas of race. And it's really interesting to watch some of these films from certain eras in history about aliens and think about the racial connotations of those films. And especially when you look at what was going on in the world at the time, they're hard to ignore.
I've never thought about it that way. I was just always scared of Alien.
Yeah.
But I can totally see that.
Yeah.
Looking back at it now, I'm going to have to go rewatch it with that lens.
Yeah. Well, it's quite a different experience because you look at the type of fear that they have, of the alien. You even look at the conversations they have around, what the alien, could do to them. And you look at, even throughout culture, we don't hear the term as much anymore. But, when I was growing up, it's considered a pejorative term now. But, you would hear the term illegal aliens all the time. And, people didn't necessarily think it was derogatory back then. But, we look back now and it's like, oh, my word, I can't believe, we would call people by that term. But look at the connection.
I mean, you still hear that when people use the term like invasion.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's still being used.
Yeah. There's all these interesting alien-related terms that go back to this fear where ideas around aliens end up being these containers for ideas about race and fears of all different types of otherness in other people.
Yeah, it's interesting how aliens can be used for fear and aliens can be used for exaltation.
Yeah.
And they're still both kind of held there. And they're even held there even in the show Ancient Aliens, of like they had these horrible, horrendous fights, but they also taught us these amazing things. And it's almost like, I don't want to use this comparison, but it's almost like when you see people being like, oh, these are illegal immigrants and these are the good immigrants. Like it can be seen in that way, of the sense of other, of like, well, these are the good other and these are the bad other.
Yeah. That is such, I think, a temptation for human beings to bifurcate everything into good and bad, and the world is rarely that simple.
Never.
But what is simple is contacting us if you desire to. And Torri, how could someone simply get a hold of us if they desired to do so?
I mean, you can always shoot us an email at skeletonkeys@gmail.com. Also, if you vaguely resemble the Predator, I am available. You can also Follow us on the socials at Skeleton Keys Pod on Twitter and Instagram. You can give me a holler. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Torri Yates Orr.
And you can give me a holler at John, JOHNKBUCHER on Twitter, or simply Telling a Better Story on Instagram. This was a lot of fun. I don't know that we could ever fully mine the depths of aliens, ancient aliens,
There's
and
so
race.
many episodes.
But I know we'll have to return to this subject at some point. But thanks for tuning in. If you like what you hear, please go and give us a rating and a review on iTunes. It would mean so much to us. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time on Skeleton Keys.
You've been listening to the Skeleton Keys podcast with Torri Yates Orr and John Booker, a podcast that unlocks the mysteries of mythology and history in pop culture. Contact us at skeletonkeys.podcast@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Skeleton Keys Pod. Skeleton Keys is a production of Sideshow Media Group.